to Showbiz Chicago and the Music Theater International Showcase podcast. I'm your host, Michael Roberts, and I have a new friend with me. His name is Arlo Hill, a veteran on Broadway on such a young age. But you can see him many times. He is a recurring fan of the opera, and he is a staple of encores, it seems, with much on our topic today, Frank Loesser, as he appeared in The Most Happy Fella and Where's Charlie, also in Little Me and Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. Arlo Hill, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. So happy to be here. Thanks for calling me a veteran of Broadway. That's very kind.
Well, I know. And what, you're like 18, right?
No. Give or take a decade. Yeah.
There you go. So you're going to be performing basically the Frank Loesser songbook at 54 Below, one of our favorite little night spots in New York, on July 2nd. So first of all, tell us a little bit about your fascination with Frank Loesser.
Okay, yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, I know we're going to be talking about Frank, and I want to, Frank, as I call him, having, spent so much time reading about his life, I feel like I almost as if I know him. A caveat, which is I am by no means an expert on Frank Loesser and on, all of his music biography. I am, an enthusiast who loves his music, and I've been really excited to do some of the, research on his, for no pun intended, lesser-known songs and stories. So I think kind of what planted the seeds for me was when I did Where's Charlie at Encores back, was this 3 years ago? And that was Frank Loesser's first Broadway show in 1948, and I didn't know it at all. Just like anyone else, I knew Guys and Dolls and How to Succeed and Baby It's Cold Outside and What Do You Do New Year's Eve. But I loved that show. It's such a beautiful score. And Frank Loesser's widow, Jo Sullivan Loesser, came and she spoke at a talkback at the end, and she had some wonderful stories, and I got really interested in this guy and his music, and then I kept on hearing Frank Loesser songs, in classes I would take. Through the audition door, I'd hear a beautiful song, and I'd ask, who wrote that song? And the answer would always be Frank Loesser. So I thought, I think something's, sending me a message. I need to do a show. I need to, just sing some Frank Loesser music.
So what about his music, Arlo, and his lyrics? Because he is a profound lyricist, every bit as good as Oscar Hammerstein or Stephen Sondheim. But what about him touches you?
It's hard to put into words. I love his lyrics. He was, for many years a lyricist before he, during the war, he just started composing his own music and then continued after that. Before that, he wrote just lyrics and collaborated with so many great composers. I think some of his songs, you just think, who else could have written that? They're so unique. They're so clever, and they're so touching at the same time.
People don't realize. Oh, go on. I'm sorry. I was going to say what people don't even realize. I mean, people don't realize the songs that he wrote, especially during the war. And he wrote an Oscar for "Baby It's Cold Outside," and the whole score for Hans Christian Andersen. I mean,
that's right.
Who didn't grow up and cry about Inchworm and Thumbelina? And
it's funny. That's one of those things that Inchworm. I listened to that, on a CD when I was in kindergarten. They used to play it during our nap hour, and I loved that song. And I would sing it for years. And when I learned it was Frank Loesser, I just couldn't believe it. I was like, no, that's some song I heard in some great little song I heard in kindergarten. I love. That's not Frank Loesser's song.
Right.
And his war songs. You mentioned. Baby It's Cold Outside, which is, probably one of his best-known songs. It's an amazing song. He wrote that for his first wife, Lynn, and him to sing at parties. It was their song. They sang it at a party that they threw. People loved it. They started, they got invitations to all sorts of other parties to come and sing their song. It was really, really popular. And then he sold it. Was it, I think, to Universal? For use in a film.
Right, exactly. Yep.
Yeah, and Lynn was really not happy with that. She felt it was their song, and she felt a little betrayed by that. But it won an Academy Award, and he said, I had to let go of that song. I felt like I could never write anything as good again if I didn't, sell it and move on to something else.
Well, and it's funny because everybody does equate that with like a Christmas song, and it was written as a love song, just like you said. So
that's
amazing
right.
how these songs take on their own public image.
Yeah, it is. And there is a recording of Frank singing that with Lynn, which is just fantastic that you can find.
And also doing some research, and this is why I love interviewing artists like yourself, because it makes me delve into why I started doing these interviews in the first place, to expose the talent on some of the people that we're familiar with, but just the work they've given us. And I got to do research because of you on Tin Pan Alley. Now, I've heard of Tin Pan Alley and some of the great artists and songs that come out of there. But I really, when I was researching for you to do this interview, I really delved into Tin Pan Alley. And my God, what a workshop that place was. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, it was. I mean, it's just a completely commercial enterprise, and they would sign songwriter. They would sign songwriters for like a year contract to churn out as many songs as they could write, and they had pianists that their job was to try to to popularize these songs, and people would go into like a sheet music store and they'd say, hey, play some good popular tunes. And they'd play the pianist would play various songs, and they'd decide which music to purchase based on it. So I know they had these teams of lyricists and composers just churning things out, and the producers, sorry, not the producers, the heads of the publishing house would pick a few things to publish.
Right. I mean, it was just craziness. And it was actually a spot in New York City. It was called Tin Pan Alley. It just took on a term of its own. But it's just, to think that something like that would exist in today's world is unheard of with copyright laws and all that. But just to have a group of artists just to go in and say, hey, I need a wedding song. And I'll become a wedding song.
That's right. It was almost like indentured servitude in a way. Frank Loesser, I think his first contract he got, he was working with a composer, a friend of his, Irving Achtman, who was also the music director of Guys and Dolls later, and they got a contract with Leo Feist, I think, was the publishing house in the Tin Pan Alley. And it was like a year's contract to write as many songs as they could, and they got a $100 advance. And Frank was really excited about that, and he went home and had it changed into singles and scattered the bills around the room to celebrate. And none of their songs were published. That was it. They worked for a year, and nothing was published.
Well, so in your concert, when you're picking material to do, tell me how you delved into fitting your concert into a narrative to tell the story.
Yeah, that's been really interesting. Because first of all, I wanted to use a lot of songs that aren't as well known. I definitely want songs that people associate with Frank Loesser and which they might expect, but I wanted to sing a lot of songs of his that I love, and which some of them which haven't even been published, which my music director and I lifted from some recordings of Loesser singing them himself. So I had this.
Please tell me, Arlo, you're doing Bloop Bleep.
I'm not doing Bloop Bleep. I love that song. And there's a great recording of Frank Loesser singing it himself.
Yes,
I'm not doing it, unfortunately.
Talk about self-counterpoint on a song, and the lyrics are just, even for people that have not heard Bloop Bleep, you can hear it on YouTube. But it's just basically he was up late at night because his faucet kept dripping, and he did all these lyrics, and it goes into the most bizarre things, like they shouldn't have eaten that clam soup. It just goes.
That's also, I that's one of those songs that I think nobody but Frank Loesser could have written, because it's about this, this most, mundane thing, just the dripping faucet, and it goes into all these thoughts running through his head. I can't sleep. Maybe I shouldn't have eaten that clam soup, and then it goes into this. I can't get the girl next door out of my head. What is it about the girl next door? What is it? What does she do to me? What does she do to me? Bloop, bleep, then back to that. And the music blossoms. And it's just, he creates this completely, recognizable and understandable moment and story in just the dripping of the faucet. I just think it's a tour de force, really.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's one of the most fascinating songs I think I've ever heard. And you can hear so much of his work that came later in that. I mean, I hear Fugue for Tin Horns in Bloop Bleep.
Yeah.
I really do.
Yeah. Well,
just
so
like
I had
the counterpoint on it.
wealth. Yeah, the counterpoint, exactly. I had the wealth of material to choose from. A lot of songs, that I had dug up that I had never known, and most people don't know. And I did want to fit them into a sort of a narrative. I am telling the story of his life through various stories, but it's more or less chronological. So that was a little bit confining. But then there are some songs that I can fit in here and there just because they fit into the narrative, even though they might be not entirely in order. So it was really a lot of moving songs around and trying to figure out what worked and what worked because this is the song he wrote next, versus what works because this really matches the feel of this moment, even though it isn't strictly chronological. So I use songs in both ways because they tell the story and because the lyrics match what the feel of this moment or story that I'm talking about, even though he didn't write it at that time.
So how did you feel, Arlo, when you're going through his plethora of material and arcing the story? How do you feel how his music progressed as his life progressed? Can you see changes in his music in the different decades that reflected changes in his personal life and how he grew as a composer and a lyricist? What kind of arc did you see in picking the material there?
That's a really interesting question. I think the most interesting kind of moment is when he wrote Most Happy Fella. And Most Happy Fella it's my favorite score of any musical, and it's so unusual. People have there's an argument: is it an opera? Is it not an opera? He Frank Lesser liked to say it's just a musical with a lot of music. It's not an opera, but elements are operatic. And I think this comes.
I think
you want to call it? It definitely has musical theater songs in it. It's kind of a strange hybrid, and that's why I love so much about it. You have this big dramatic moment. In Act 2, you have these beautiful arias and arioso, and then in the middle of nowhere, you have I made a fist. Right. this
right.
totally musical theater song, and I just love that. And I think this gets down to the issue of Frank's relationship and understanding of more, quote unquote, serious classical highbrow music. So he grew up. His father was a piano teacher. His mother was an accompanist, and his brother, his half brother, Arthur Lesser, went on to become a renowned concert pianist. And he later was the head of the piano department at the Cleveland Institute of Music. So Frank Lesser, he grew up surrounded by classical music. But he was more interested in popular music, and then later, he didn't study piano formally, but he certainly that seeped into his bones, and he was, had an incredible ear and could just pick things up by the time he was, 3 or 4 years old. And then in interviews in the 40s, he says, I can't read a note of music. I can't read. He claims he can't read music at all. And I was listening to an interview with Michael Feinstein, who says there's no way that's true, that the guy that wrote Most Happy Fella could have 10 years earlier not been able to read music.
Right.
Whether or not that's true, I think Frank kind of created this persona of someone. I don't. He had grown up surrounded by classical music, and Schubert and Brahms, I think, were really in him. But he liked to say, I'm not interested in that stuff. I just write popular music. So I think with Most Happy Fella, that's when he showed, hey, actually, I haven't been entirely honest. I have this love and understanding of music that's broader than just your typical musical comedy or pop song on the radio. It's so complex, and no one could have written that who didn't have who hadn't grown up with the music that he had, I think. So I think that score is very revealing, and it shows him as a much more complex writer than anything had to that point.
In interviews and research you've done about him, how did he handle his fame, especially after Guys and Dolls, and personally, and with his kids and his marriage. How was he as a person?
I think he wore his fame loosely. When he got the Pulitzer Prize, he and Abe Burrows got the Pulitzer Prize for How to Succeed in Business, and he liked to call it his Putzler. He didn't take it very seriously. I asked when I sat down with his widow, Jo Sullivan, I asked about that, and I said, well, he must have been really, happy and proud to get the Pulitzer Prize. And she said, I think secretly he was, but he didn't let on. He just kind of made it all like it was a big joke. I think he was very proud of his success and that he could support himself, and he supported his mother all of her life and his family. And he was a very astute businessman. He created Frank Music to publish his songs and mentored other songwriters. And I think he wanted to make sure that he left a legacy in place.
Well, yeah, I wanted to touch on that. He was one of the first composers really to house his own music and license it, and it was an incubator for many other composers too. So
it was. I think that was really smart because when he was working in Hollywood, and I think at the time he really felt like he didn't have much creative control. I mean, he certainly didn't have much creative control. There's this great quote. He says, the way it worked in these movie studios, that the producer orders a certain title, the music director orders a certain rhythm, the dance director orders a certain number of bars, and the composers order a certain number of aspirin. And I love that quote, and obviously it shows his frustration with the way that things worked and how he has to write everything to spec. And I think so later in his life, with Most Happy Fella, where he did the book and music and lyrics, and from that point forward, he tried to gain a lot of control over every creative aspect, and then even the business side of things. He always wanted to do things the way he wanted to do them. That was his personality too.
Well, a little known fact, too, for our listeners out there about Most Happy Fella. The lead producers on Most Happy Fella was Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz.
Oh, that's right, yeah. Just incredible. And and his first wife, Lynn Garland, she also produced it, which is interesting. She had produced and helped to cast it.
Yes, absolutely. So I want to give you a quote from Stephen Schwartz that I saw in an interview. If you can just touch on that a little bit about what he said about Frank Loesser. He says that he is aware of the idiosyncratic speech of his characters, which is one of the things that makes his lyrics of his characters jump out and make them believable. And he was. I know he was talking about Guys and Dolls and How to Succeed, but what can you tell our listeners about that idiosyncratic speech pattern?
Well, that's why I think Guys and Dolls was such an amazing and unusual musical. He took these Damon Runyon stories, this way of street speech patterns. And he was able to musicalize it. I think he had a really good ear for speech, the way it was, the way it was commonly spoken. And I'm trying to think of good examples of, because he has all these wonderful rhymes that only work if you speak it the way this character would speak it. And no examples are coming to me right now. But I'm sure he must have been a pioneer in some ways of. There's one. I know there's one in Take Back Your Mink, which only works. The rhyme only works because that's the way Adelaide speaks. It wouldn't rhyme if any other character sang it.
Right. I mean, and boy, what a game changer Guys and Dolls was. I mean, the beauty of Most Happy Fella and the period piece of How to Succeed. But Guys and Dolls is a game changer. I mean, it's called probably the greatest Broadway musical, out there. But, I mean, and just how it holds up. I mean, because those are characters without being caricatures of the time period, which is, I think, so hard to do.
They're just larger-than-life characters that are, still totally, believable as larger-than-life people.
Let's talk about your accompanist, since they are the backbone to all its performers. Who is your accompanist, and how do you go through the process of the concert?
My accompanist is Rick Hip Flores. He's a fantastic pianist, music director, composer, conductor. Right now he's playing in the Pit for Rocky on Broadway, and he's assistant conducting as well. He's going to, I think, very soon be doing some conducting in that show. So he's played in the Pit and subbed in the Pit of many Broadway musicals. He was recently the music director on We Will Rock You, the Queen musical.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. One of my best friends is lead in that, Brian Crum.
Oh, really? Well, I'm sure they know each other. He's an incredible, he's as good as any pianist I've ever worked with, and there's no better confidence. And most importantly, he's really excited about this show and working with me on it. It's really hard, I think in cabarets in general, you have this show and to just hire a pianist to come in and, hey, here's the music, come in and play it. Really, he's the backbone. You need to work together on it very closely. So I've come in with a lot of ideas and this script that I've, written and have been working on over time. And we sing through things and talk through things, and he tells me very honestly what he thinks works and what doesn't work. We have to do arrangements of some songs to figure out how they're going to work in the show dramatically. Right now we're in the process of I'm doing a medley of a bunch of Frank Loesser's Hollywood songs, which is really fun. So that's, just getting all the transitions to work. That's taking a lot of work on my part, but obviously on his part as well. And he just provides...
I'm sorry. So when you're doing some of these work, and a lot of them are lesser known, where are you drawing the sheet music from? Is some of it unpublished, and do you have to go into the estate with Mrs. Loesser's consent, or is everything out there?
That's a great question. A lot of the music is published, even the stuff that isn't so well known. Like, for instance, the last show that Frank Loesser wrote, Signor Discretion himself, I'm singing a wonderful song from that show called I Cannot Let You Go. Now, that show never came to Broadway. It was never produced while Frank Loesser was alive. It wasn't produced until, I think, the 80s. There was a reading of it, and then there was a stage production of it later. But there are the sheets that you can get, and I've talked to his estate about that. Another example is this song, one of his earliest songs that we have the music and lyrics for, a song that Frank Loesser wrote with music by William Schumann, who was his friend. He later went on to become, a well-known classical composer. It's a song called Where the Grass Grows Green, and the only version of that we have is this little dinky recording the two of them made on, some old, I can't remember the name, some kind of at-home recording device. And so Rick and I sat down and lifted what we could from that recording, and then changed some things around a little bit and did a different arrangement. So that's the kind of stuff that's really fun. I don't know if anyone's really done that before. I know that recording's out there, but I don't think this certainly isn't a song that people perform. And it's a fun song.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Yeah. So while you're talking to Joe, what did you learn about Frank that our listeners didn't know, and what surprised you about him through her?
Well, first of all, she was so wonderful. She was so generous with her time and enthusiastic and warm, and I was so excited to be there talking to her, and she was wonderful. I was also honestly, a little nervous because I spend a lot of time putting together this story, and I have sort of my own take on Frank Loesser and some, parts of his life and the own story that I want to tell based on my research and then filling the gaps of that research. And you never know, you might sit down with someone who actually knows him or knew him who will say, no, actually, that's not quite right. No, that story it's a little different. So I was a little worried that she would say I would learn actually all these things I had planned to talk about were not quite right. So I was happy, I was relieved and gratified that she, I think, supported and gave me additional juicy details on some stories, and I think also agreed with some of my takes. So I'll give you a couple of examples. There's this great story I had mentioned to you earlier about Frank Loesser nearly getting in a fight with Frank Sinatra. And the story is Frank Loesser was on set for the film of Guys and Dolls, and he's listening to Sinatra, crooning away at his songs. He actually he wrote some additional songs for Frank Sinatra for the film, and he was singing them in Frank Sinatra style, not in Guys and Dolls style. So Frank Loesser comes up to him afterwards, and very angry, and he says, why don't we go back to why don't we schedule a time for you to come over to my place, and I'll give you a coaching on these songs. And Frank Sinatra says, if you want to work with me, you can come to my dressing room. And things escalate, and they start screaming expletives at each other. And the way I heard it, they there's a couple different tellings of the story. They nearly got in a fight and had to be pulled apart. So I asked Jo Sullivan about this, and she said they got in a fist fight. And I said, really?
Wow.
She said, yes, they had to be physically pulled apart. They got in a fist fight. And I thought to myself, great, that makes the story so much better.
Wow.
And, if she says it, then I can certainly tell the story that way. So that was, I think that's a great detail. And, the other part of the story is they never spoke again. And then Frank Sinatra swore he would never sing another Frank Loesser song for the rest of his life. Which, of course, we know he did. 5 years later, 5 years later, there was a call. Frank Loesser received a call, and it was about Frank Sinatra wanting to write some songs. So he puts on the phone, and he screamed to his wife, I won!
Wow. How fantastic is that? And then do you think like a Frank Loesser could survive musically with how corporate Broadway has gotten? Do you think his music would still transcend that corporation status, or do you think he would have a hard time getting his musicals produced?
That's a really good question. I don't know. He was such a savvy businessman. I feel like if he were alive today, he would, be in control. He would make sure that he was in control of the business. That he wouldn't be at the beck and call, or his musicals wouldn't be at the whim of other producers. I think he really worked hard so that his music would be popular enough so that he could go out on his own musically. In business with his own songs and be able to take total control. But I don't know. That's a really good question. Things certainly were different at that time, and I think he was a pioneer in many ways.
Right. And was he sick during How to Succeed? And did people know how sick he was? Or did his widow touch on that at all? Because that was kind of like his quintessential, moment, like in the 60s when he won the Pulitzer and all that. But then it seemed like his health declined very quickly after that.
Well, let's see. How to Succeed, that was 1961. I think... That was actually, he was still pretty much in top form. That happened to be his last Broadway show. They did do some of his shows at revivals of shows at City Center, I believe. And he was, working very hard. Sorry, was that 1961? Sorry, I think I've got my dates confused. But anyways, he was, I think it wasn't really until, the next show he worked on was 1965, Pleasures and Palaces, which he worked on with Bob Fosse, and that opened and closed in Detroit and never made it to Broadway. And then he started working on this next show, Senior Discretion himself. I think it wasn't really till around then, he was a chain smoker, he had a bad cough for a long time, but I think it wasn't until later in the 60s that he was first became diagnosed with emphysema and then later developed lung cancer. And I think it was then, while he was working on Senior Discretion around 1967, 1968, that it really began to affect him. And many of his friends died around that time. I think that it was a hard time for him for a number of reasons. But I think it wasn't until later in the 60s that it was, he passed away in 1969. But I don't think it was until then, according to my understanding of it, that his health was in decline.
Well, and I believe his daughter wrote a biography about him, but just talking about, he used to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and make a martini and peanut butter and olive sandwiches. And now I know he was a Scotch drinker, but ew.
I know. That's right. Susan Lesser, she wrote A Most Remarkable Fella, and that's the first, where my research started, and it's a wonderful book. Great stories, but she also, I think, is a great writer. I would recommend that to anyone who has any interest in Frank Lesser. But yes, and other people, his wife has confirmed that he would wake up around 4 and write, and then when his wife would get up, hours later, she would be having her coffee, and he would be having his first martini of the day.
I love it. And apparently my time of day from Guys and Dolls kind of stemmed from, that was his schedule. He used to love, writing at that time.
I'm singing that song in my show, which it's such a special song. It's like an art song. It's so beautiful. It's so unusual. It's the texture is so rich. I'm singing a couple of songs from Guys and Dolls. That's one of them. And that's exactly the context for it. I really think, it is about how he would like to be up around 4 in the morning to think and to write when the telephone wasn't going to ring. And he really enjoyed that, time of day or time of night, depending on your perspective.
Right. And I heard you never wanted to wake him up from a nap.
Yes. Let sleeping dogs make lesser lie, yeah.
How do you think? I don't know if there was any word on it. How do you think he felt about the film versions of his musicals?
Well, we know how he felt about Frank Sinatra singing his songs. He didn't like that very much. I think, in her book, his daughter Susan says she thinks he never watched that movie. But popular versions of his songs in general, I think when his shows were on the stage, when they were on Broadway, he wanted the songs to be sung exactly the way he intended them to be sung. This was in the theater. This was when they were being heard for the first time. This was in the context of the show. He really wanted it to be sung a certain way. And he was, very demanding in that. You mentioned earlier the story of him slapping an actress in the face. That's true.
Yes.
That was a pretty awful example, but yes, he was very demanding. When his music was on the radio and people would interpret them, his songs however they liked, he was okay with that. He said, this is great. People already know the music. It's popular. Let them do what they want with it. I think by that point, the money was rolling in and people knew the songs, and now at this point, people can interpret it how they want. I think that makes a lot of sense. The songs are written to be on stage. If it's a theater song, it only works a certain way dramatically. If you're just singing it as a popular tune on the radio, it makes sense that can be a different version of it.
And why do you think it is, Arlo, that How to Succeed, it keeps coming up with revivals, even more so than Guys and Dolls, it seems, at least on Broadway lately, because there's the Matthew Broderick version, and now I call it the Harry Potter version. But the Daniel Radcliffe version. But of all the shows, and of course, Guys and Dolls had one of the biggest revivals ever with Nathan Lane. But How to Succeed, of all the shows, just keeps coming and selling out. And why do you think that show seems to be a staple right now of our pop culture?
I guess as satire, as sometimes. During certain times, and people need satire of business and the world. Also, I think it's a great show, and it's a really great. I was talking about songs that really work as theater songs. It's a great example of a show where not many of the songs work outside the context of the show. You don't hear that many of those songs.
You are so right about that. That's right.
Yeah,
absolutely. It's a score that functions as a whole.
Yeah, it was such a tight collaboration between Frank Lesser and Abe Burrows. Interestingly, Frank Lesser was not proudest of that score. He really, I think, enjoyed writing it, and it was great. Maybe that's why he joked around with his Pulitzer, his Putzler. He didn't think it was one of his greatest scores, but it works so well as a whole. And you can't really pull out any piece throughout the whole thing crumbles. I Believe in You, sometimes you'll hear that outside of the show, but even then you have to change context. It's not going to be a man singing it to himself in the mirror with a chorus of kazoo, razors.
Right. And another thing I found about that show, they just did a revival of it in Chicago, that you have to be very careful to keep it in that time period. Even moving it, whoever the designer was of the Chicago production seemed to get his 60s and 70s deco design confused. And then once it pulls it out of there, the way women, I don't want to say subjugate, but that's how women were portrayed back then.
Well, exactly. I mean, that's why a secretary is not a toy. If you don't get the tone on that exactly right, it's the audience
right.
Everyone's going to tighten up, and it's not going to work.
Absolutely. Which is amazing, I guess, in the Mad Men era that we're in right now. Maybe that's part of the push as well. But yeah, sure. I think it's really a little time capsule of that. I think it's perfection in how office politics worked, how women worked, and just to see really how far everything's come from them. I think How to Succeed works so well on so many levels, in so many social, political ways too.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting. Speaking of a secretary is not a toy, and what becomes dated, what of Frank Loesser's things are dated and what aren't. Like we were talking about Baby It's Cold Outside, and which is a great song that you hear around the holidays every year. A lot of people also have trouble with it. If they say, hey, what kind of song was this? It's no means no. It sounds like, there's the line, hey, what's in this drink? So I think there's been a lot of, things online about it. Actually, the comedians Key and Peele do this fantastic, if you haven't seen it, they do this fantastic parody of Baby It's Cold Outside.
I haven't watched it.
It's very funny, where it's much more, a little bit more aggressive, except, it ends up being that the woman ends up being in control of the situation. But that's one of those things that it's a little bit difficult in this day and age. I think that's some of that may be true about some of the songs and How to Succeed as well, outside of the context.
And so let's talk a little bit about you. What was the first musical that you saw that you said, my God, this is the life I have to pursue for myself?
It's so funny. I think about that because I know the first show I saw on Broadway was Kiss Me, Kate, with Brian Stokes Mitchell, which was such a great first production to see.
Absolutely.
I grew up in Cleveland, going to the Cleveland Playhouse, which is wonderful. They do wonderful theater. I was thinking about this recently. I think one of the first shows I saw that was there were many, but that was such an intense experience, and I went back and saw it again, was an Irving Berlin show. I can't even think of, I have to look it up. I can't remember what the title was, but it was biographical. It was about Irving Berlin, and it went through the story of his life, and I didn't know any of his music at the time. I knew some of it, but I remember hearing What'll I Do for the first time, and the context in the show was, his wife had died years ago, and then she appears on stage and sings to him, What'll I Do, and You Are Far Away, and it was just, I think I'm interested in the songs in musical theater even more than the musicals as a whole. I love cabaret. I love just the storytelling of a song. Another big event for me was the cabaret singer Steve Ross, who he's called the Crown Prince of Cabaret. When I was a kid, we came to New York and we saw him sing Cole Porter songs, and that was kind of the first time I really, Cole Porter, wow, this guy's amazing. I should listen to his songs. So I think for me, it's more been hearing these songs and the storytelling of an individual song. That's what I really came to love and became so excited about, and that's why I fell in love with the theater.
Then play a sweet walrus pot with a pirate's head and a pirate's heart.
Well, and what was the first show you were in?
The first show I was in, well, in middle school, I did Curly in Oklahoma. That was a big one for me.
Well, and you know what? I was just talking to a bunch of people the past few months. I was doing some education programs in Chicago, and just the lack of musical theater that's happening now in the schools is just amazing. There's no funding. There's no financial support. These teachers are funding their music classes on their own. It's just so sad because, I mean, like, my high school music director is the one that pushed me towards theater. I mean, it's just, there's just such a lack of it right now.
Yeah, no, I mean, this goes with all the cutting in the arts in general. I was very fortunate to grow up. I'm from, just outside of Cleveland, Shaker Heights, Ohio, and Shaker Heights High School. I had.
It's a great mall.
Yeah. and Beechwood, just adjacent, the Beechwood Mall. That's right.
Yep, absolutely.
Shaker Square. But my teacher in high school, James Thornton, he was an incredible teacher. He was a genius. He was, one of these people who I think if he had not been a teacher but had gone on to be a director, he could have been. He was as good as any director I worked with in my life. He was just incredible, and I was so fortunate to work with him. And he definitely changed my life, and I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing today if not for him. So I hope that other kids have that opportunity.
Well, and what was the experience of doing Jack Brel like for you, traveling overseas and performing that show? That must have been a quintessential life-changing experience.
You do it in New York, actually.
Oh, I thought you were doing it overseas.
I wish.
Did you do it in
wish. I'm sorry?
Let's get arrangements. I apologize. For some reason, I thought you actually did it in Amsterdam for some reason. But I just...
Well, I sang the song in Amsterdam. I mean, I sang the song Amsterdam. So
maybe, you know what? I bet that's what it was. I bet that's what it was.
I'm singing in Amsterdam. Yeah, if I could sing in the Port of Amsterdam, that will be a goal for me.
There you go. So, and one thing I wanted to touch on I'm such a fan of the Encore series that they do. What is the rehearsal process like for them?
It's changed a bit. It used to be really a week. Now it's more of a week and a half. Some of the principals come in earlier. The dancers do some prep work the week before. It's very fast. I want to say the Encores, I too am such a fan. I say now of every single Encore show, I want to see it or I want to be in it. Either one would be fine. But there's advantages to both. I didn't get to see most Happy Fella. I would have loved to, but I was pretty fortunate to be in it. The rehearsals now are about a week and a half. And part of it is the contract changed. It used to be that when it started, it was a real concert series on book. Everybody had book in hand. It was very much standing and singing, lightly staged. It's become more and more staged and choreographed, and then the scripts. The contract required that your scripts were in hand. So there became this sort of scriptography where, you step on your right foot and you turn, and switch your score to your left hand and then turn around. When I did Where's Charlie, the new Ashmolean Marching Society and Music Conservatory Band, that number, we had to so intricately choreograph what we did with our scripts. And it's just, can't we just put these things down? Well, they changed the contract a year or two later so that now the language is you may have scripts in hand. And I think as part of that, they had to extend the rehearsal time a little bit, up the pay. And it does put some pressure on, I think, the principals in particular. Oh no, if he's going to be off book, I'm going to look bad if I'm not off book. So it's
right. Wow. And when does the orchestra come in for something like that?
We do. Let's see. Usually they do a Wednesday evening dress rehearsal. That Saturday before is the Sitzprobe with the orchestra. That's their first time singing with the orchestra. And then we do one day or one half day with the orchestra before the dress rehearsal. So it's not much time with the orchestra. That Sitzprobe, they do over at Carol Music, that huge music space on the west side. And it's the most exciting day, especially for Most Happy Fella, because that was a 38-piece orchestra. And just walking into that room and seeing them, let alone hearing that full sound of all those, 20 strings or more, I can't remember. It's such an exciting experience. Everyone's like nearly in tears at the sound of it, I think.
Wow, I know. Encores is such a remarkable gift to musical theater. It is. I can't praise them enough.
The music director is I think he's such a gift as well. He's such an incredibly talented conductor and music director, and just a really good guy. So I've been very, very fortunate to be involved with those shows.
So Arlo, if people want to, in New York, come and see you, or people want to fly in to see your show, how does one get tickets for 54 Below? I know they have their own website, and they can purchase tickets on there, I believe.
That's right, yeah, 54below.com/artist/Arlo-Hill, or you can just go to my website, arlohill.com, and I have a link there to get tickets. And the other show is Wednesday, July 2nd at 7 p.m. at 54 Below.
Wow, what a fantastic club that is, too.
It is. It's my first time performing there. I've seen a couple things there. I saw Steve Ross there 2 weeks ago, and it's really great food, great view wherever you sit, and it's a really nice, intimate venue. So I'm really excited to be there.
Fantastic. And the question I want to leave you with is, what do you think the biggest misconception is about cabaret, and what during your show do you want to get across to the audience about Frank Loesser? So I guess it's a twofold final question. So, what do you think the biggest misconception is about cabaret and that art form?
I'm not sure about misconceptions. I think there's many different kinds of cabaret, and many different, if historically there have been many different kinds of cabaret. And I think what I'm doing is it's a sort of a hybrid. I'm calling it a cabaret. I'm also calling it a solo show. It's one-man show about Frank Loesser. It's much more of a specific storytelling and arc and biography than the typical cabaret would be. I want people to realize and to get excited about all of this Frank Loesser music that they probably haven't heard before. To be excited as I am about Frank Loesser the person, and what a alive, exciting, eccentric, and genius person he was, and then just how special his lyrics and his music were. And I think if I can get people to listen to it in a way they haven't before, because of the stories or because some of this music they haven't heard before, I would have really accomplished my goal.
Wow, fantastic. Well, we're going to have to get your Tushy to Chicago and do the Frank Loesser concert as well. There's a great cabaret club here called Davenport's. Yeah. I
was born in Chicago, actually.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and I have not been back since I was 1 year old. So I would love to come back to this show. That would be great. Wow.
Well, you know what? The weather hasn't changed since you've been gone, Arlo.
Great.
No, I will absolutely be in touch, and we will get your ass over to Chicago, you and your accompanist. We're going to put you in Davenport, where Sarah Ford performed.
Oh, wonderful.
All right, Arlo, thank you so much for your time, and everybody go see this man. It's Frank Loesser, my God, one of the greatest composers that have ever lived, that changed the face of musical theater. So I'm so glad you're doing this.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Michael. It's such a pleasure to talk to you.
Likewise, Arlo. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Standing on the corner, watching all the girls go by. Brother, you don't know a nicer occupation. Matter of fact, neither do I. Then standing on the corner, watching all the girls, watching all the girls, watching all the girls go by.
My poor, poor feet. Bet you your life a waitress earns her pay. I've been on my feet, my poor, poor feet, all day long today. Doing my blue plate special ballet.
Too long in one town, and the harvest times come and gone. You're from Big D. Oh, I can guess by the way you draw and the way you dress. You're from Big D. My, oh yes. I mean Big D, little A-double-L-A-S. And that spells Dallas, my darling, darling Dallas. Don't it give you pleasure to confess that you're from Big D? My, oh yes. I mean Big D, little A-double-L-A. Big D, little A-double-L-A. Big D, little A-double-L-A, yes.